There once was a time when there were no freeways. Imagine no traffic jams. But it did take longer to get to places that today might seem routine. The driving force behind the freeways that provide today's convenience and economic opportunity was President Dwight D. Eisenhower, who in 1919 took a cross-country road trip with the Army. I'm Bob Summers, and this is a presidential story. Today, there are 279 million registered cars and trucks in the United States, or almost one per person. By contrast, in 1900, there were only 8,000 vehicles, or about one motorized vehicle per 9,000 people. With so few motorized vehicles, there was not a lot of demand for the infrastructure to support them. Gas stations, stop signs, rest stops, and roads made out of asphalt or concrete instead of packed dirt or maybe mud on a rainy day. Driving a motor car was not just a convenient way to get from one place to another. It was an adventure. The adventure continued when in 1908, Henry Ford introduced the Model T. Known as the Tin Lizzie, the Model T was the first dependable, mass-produced car. And because it was mass-produced, it was one-third the cost of other motor cars, making it affordable to everyday people, not just the wealthy. Over the next 19 years, 15 million Model Ts were sold. With cars now becoming a necessity, the infrastructure to support motor vehicles needed to improve. In 1916, Congress passed the Federal Aid Road Act to construct an ad hoc national network of highways. The 5-year, $75 million in funding collapsed when revenue was needed for World War I. After World War I, the U.S. Army recognized that there was a need for better roads across the U.S. in case troop and equipment movement was necessary. They devised an experiment to test the roads and Army vehicles, as well as raise awareness and interest amongst the public for better roads and motor vehicles for military purposes. On July 7, 1919, the first transcontinental motor convoy, which included 81 vehicles and 297 personnel, departed from the Ellipse near the White House on their way to San Francisco, California. One of those people included on the trip was 28-year-old Lieutenant Colonel Dwight Eisenhower. Eisenhower went along as a Tank Corps observer. Decades later, he wrote that he joined the convoy partly for a lark and partly to learn. We were not sure it could be accomplished at all. Nothing of the sort had ever been attempted. Averaging less than 6 miles per hour, or about 58 miles per day, the trucks wound their way from Washington up to Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, then into Ohio, west across the agricultural Midwest, over the Rocky Mountains, before arriving in California. Generally, they followed the Lincoln Highway, later known as US 30, whenever possible. If the idea was to road test various military vehicles and to identify the challenges of moving troops from coast to coast, then the setbacks they experienced were exactly what they were looking for. The vehicles became stuck in the mud. Their engines became clogged with sand. Crankshafts and axles broke, or they would roll off the side of narrow roads. Some bridges were too low for the trucks to pass under, so the bridges were sometimes dismantled. In total, 88 bridges were broken and repaired during the trip. Eisenhower and other observers reported on all of this and more. The roads in the Midwest were impractical until the roads were improved, but the roads in the East were good for truck use. And Eisenhower praised the roads in California. Eisenhower singled out parts of the Lincoln Highway in Utah and Nevada as so poor that it warranted a thorough investigation before government funds were spent there. And there were other logistical problems: limited sleep, lack of food and drinking water, and no shelter or bathing facilities. Finally, on September 6th, 62 days later, the convoy arrived in San Francisco. In total, they had traveled 3,251 miles. They recorded 230 road incidents, defined as adjustments, extrications, breakdowns, and accidents, which resulted in 9 of the vehicles retiring from the trip early. In addition, 21 people were injured during the trip, forcing them to end their journey early. Another part of the trip's mission was to generate public excitement. In that mission, the convoy succeeded. About 3.2 million people in 350 communities turned out to see the latest military equipment and listen to patriotic speeches. And the expedition stirred interest in road building. This interest made its way back to Washington, D.C., but there were different opinions on the federal role in highway control and ownership. Congress passed the Federal Highway Act of 1921, which strengthened the state's role in highway maintenance with some federal assistance. This temporarily quieted interest in a federal highway system. In 1930, car ownership had increased. At that time, there were 23 million vehicles on the road, one vehicle for every 5 people. The highways that existed were getting more congested. Public sentiment for federal control of an interstate superhighway system increased along with the traffic congestion. President Franklin D. Roosevelt, seeking to pull the U.S. out of the Great Depression, envisioned a network of toll superhighways as a way to provide new jobs for the unemployed. Roosevelt thought that a system of 3 east-west and 3 north-south routes would be enough. In 1938, Congress passed the Federal Highway Act, directing the Bureau of Public Roads to study Roosevelt's plan. In their 1939 report, Toll Roads and Free Roads, the Bureau concluded that, for the most part, the amount of transcontinental traffic was insufficient to support a network of toll superhighways. Instead, they recommended a 43,000-mile non-toll highway network. This master plan for free highway development proposed highways follow existing roads whenever possible, have more than 2 lanes of traffic available if traffic required it, and be limited access in high traffic areas. In the large cities, the proposal allowed for above and below grade intersections and limited access belt lines surrounding the central business district to permit traffic to bypass the inner city. Roosevelt enthusiastically endorsed the report and sent it to Congress. Roosevelt proposed the cost of the plan for free highways could be recovered by selling off federal land. Critics in and out of Congress condemned the suggestion as a socialistic scheme to transfer the cost of providing deluxe highways from those most benefited to the already heavily burdened landowner. With the outbreak of World War I, the priority for a national highway system was again dropped and defunded. However, some states moved forward with construction of toll roads. The Pennsylvania Turnpike, now I-76 and I-70, opened to traffic in October 1940 and was the prototype of the modern high-speed interstate highway. The Hutchinson River Parkway in New York and the Merritt Parkway in Connecticut, both toll roads, proved to be highly profitable. During World War II, Eisenhower was now a general and was named the Supreme Allied Commander responsible for defeating Nazi Germany. Eisenhower marveled at the vast Autobahn highway system built by the Germans before the war, writing, "During World War II, I had seen the superlative system of German Autobahn, the national highways crossing that country." These highways helped the Allied troops effectively resupply their forces as they chased the retreating German army. As the war started to turn in the Allies' favor, thoughts once again turned to a federal highway system. The Federal Aid Highway Act of 1944 once again authorized 40,000 miles of interstate highways to connect major metropolitan areas, but again failed to provide a way to pay for it. It wasn't until the Federal Aid Highway Act of 1952, 8 years later, that funds were officially appropriated. But it was a token amount, $25 million, with a 50-50 match by the states. When Eisenhower was inaugurated as president in 1953, the U.S. was now embroiled in the Korean War. So it wasn't until 1954 that Eisenhower started to push for a federal interstate highway system. Eisenhower wrote in his memoir, At Ease, "The old convoy had started me thinking about good 2-lane highways, but Germany had made me see the wisdom of broader ribbons across the land." Congress passed the next Federal Aid Highway Act in 1954, which authorized $175 million for interstate highways on a 60-40 federal-state basis. When he signed it, Eisenhower called it merely one effective forward step, with even more being needed. Eisenhower tapped his Army logistics partner from World War II, retired General Lucius Clay, to lead the President's Advisory Committee on the National Highway System. Eisenhower knew Clay, a West Point-trained engineer, to be a respected troubleshooter, an effective administrator, and politically adept. The so-called Clay Committee began work to develop a national highway plan and report back to Congress. The Clay Committee predicted a 10-year, $101 billion program, or about $1.2 trillion today, for 40,000 miles of divided highways linking all U.S. cities with populations over 50,000. However, their first ask was for only $26 billion. The committee based its proposal on 4 points. The first point related to safety. It cited 36,000 highway traffic fatalities each year. The second point reported on the physical conditions of existing roads and the cost of vehicle ownership. Poorly maintained roads increased vehicle damage and maintenance costs, increasing transportation costs for goods, which were passed along to the consumer. The third point involved national security. In 1953, the Soviet Union detonated their first hydrogen bomb, moving them closer to the United States in nuclear parity. This event rattled the U.S. public, 8 out of 10 of whom believed a nuclear conflict with the Soviet Union was imminent. A large-scale civil defense evacuation drill in June 1955 that led to confusion and congestion drove home the need for better evacuation routes. The committee highlighted the need to execute the emergency evacuation of large cities and the quick movement of troops as essential to national defense. The fourth and final point appealed to the health of the U.S. economy. The committee reported that the positive economic attributes of the highway system would increase economic growth and the well-being of the economy through speedy, safe, transcontinental travel that could improve farm-to-market movement. With all these benefits, the success of the national interstate highway system would once again come down to funding, just as it had for the past 40 years. Eisenhower initially preferred a toll system, but Clay convinced them that toll roads were not feasible outside of the highly populated coastal regions. The Clay Committee recommended issuing bonds that would be repaid over 30 years with funds from an increased federal gasoline tax. Members of Congress had their own ideas. The proposal for an interstate system with 90% federal funding was defeated in Congress despite intense efforts to find a compromise. Eisenhower kept trying. In his 1956 State of the Union address, Eisenhower stated, "Legislation to provide a modern interstate highway system is even more urgent this year than last. For 12 months have now passed in which we have fallen further behind in road construction needed for the personal safety, the general prosperity, the national security of the American people." He then continued with more statistics and the need to work together to find funding. With Eisenhower standing firm on legislation to create the interstate system, Congress went back to work and finally produced legislation that called for 90% federal funding, with money coming from a highway trust fund that received the revenue from the federal gasoline tax. Finally, on June 26th, the Federal Aid Highway Act of 1956 passed the House and the Senate. It was sent to Eisenhower, who was in Walter Reed Army Hospital with an intestinal ailment, for his signature, privately without ceremony, on June 29th. The Interstate Highway System, or IHS, was born. The IHS began with a testing facility built in central Illinois to evaluate pavement, road standards, and construction techniques. Over a 2-year period, Army trucks drove over 17 million miles on test roads, sometimes carrying concrete blocks, to see how long it would take to destroy the roads and bridges. From these tests, highway building and maintenance standards were created. For example, throughout the system, mile-long stretches of concrete pavement double as emergency landing strips for military aircraft. Many Army posts, especially where division-level units were stationed, are near interstate highways. Other technical standards are also highly regulated. Lanes must be 12 feet wide, and shoulders 10 feet wide. Bridges must have 14 feet of clearance. Grades must be less than 30%. Highways must be at least 4 lanes wide, with physical barriers or median strips between lanes of oncoming traffic, and they must be designed for travel at 70 miles per hour. The most notable attributes to the highway system is the concept of limited access. There are no at-grade crossings, meaning instead of intersections, they have overpasses or underpasses. Across the entire 42,000-mile system, there are only 16,000 interchanges. Although 90% of funds were federal, the planning and work was conducted by the states. Work began right away with Missouri and Kansas, each claiming to be the first to start building the first interstate highway, although Pennsylvania also makes that claim based on their turnpike from years earlier. When the interstate highway system was first created, Americans supported it. Soon, the unpleasant consequences began to appear. The roads had to be placed somewhere, and the cheapest land to buy were in poor, minority neighborhoods. In the first 20 years of construction, over 475,000 households, representing 1 million people across the country, were displaced. These highways then created physical barriers through cities, slicing communities in half and increasing racial segregation. Some pre-existing highways, like Route 66, were bypassed by the new interstate system, turning countless rural communities into ghost towns. Communities began to fight back. The first victory for anti-highway forces was in San Francisco, with victories following in New York City, Baltimore, Washington, D.C., New Orleans, and others. As construction abruptly stopped, it resulted in roads to nowhere. The interstates also increased congestion, smog, and car dependency. But the benefits of the interstate highway system advocated for by the Clay Committee did come true. The Clay Committee cited 36,000 highway fatalities in 1956. In 2022, that number dropped to 5,600. Passenger rail did decline sharply as America's car culture exploded. Freight rail also decreased for a bit, but the trucking industry expanded dramatically, resulting in severe decreases in shipping costs. Products were now getting into the hands of consumers faster and cheaper. Interstates have increased the mobility of all Americans, allowing them to move out of the cities and establish homes in growing suburbs. They can travel quickly from one region to another for business and vacation. Tourism dramatically expanded, creating a demand for more service stations, motels, restaurants, and visitor attractions. The interstate system now comprises over 46,000 miles with a final price tag of $129 billion. The states are responsible for maintenance, but in 1981, they began receiving federal assistance. In 1990, on the centennial of Eisenhower's birth, President George H.W. Bush redesignated the interstate system as the Dwight D. Eisenhower National System of Interstate and Defense Highways. On October 14, 1992, 35 years after construction began, the original interstate highway system was declared completed, with the opening of I-70 through Greenwood Canyon, Colorado. Following the completion of the interstate highway system, that same 62-day convoy journey from 1919 can now be completed in just 5 days. Thanks for watching.